Now that I had my living situation taken care of, it was time to give the boat a home too. With the winter weather rapidly approaching, I needed something more robust than a tarp suspended by ropes. Let me tell you about how I built a 40-foot boat shelter for $225. First, let's get the price breakdown out of the way. Tarp, $175, rope, $15, screws, about $25, and carabiners, $10. The trees were free, courtesy of the forest. The wind did a number on things here over the fall. I had stashed all my belongings under the boat to try to keep them dry, which the squirrels and mice were loving.
Hey, that's mine. You can see that it got messed up on this side. So first things first is to clean all this stuff up. Can you not do that? Dude, what are you gonna do with that? So yeah, I gotta clean all of this stuff up.
To the surprise of absolutely nobody, the tarp over the boat acted like a massive sail and stretched out to the point that it was no longer waterproof. The boatyard got trashed by the tarp flailing in the wind, and okay, maybe I also neglected the boat and got behind on organization, but I swear I had a good reason. Unfortunately, in late November, I got bit by a deer tick and contracted Lyme disease. That threw a wrench in my plans and made me pretty unwell, but I was lucky to have caught it early. I still get joint pain sometimes and have to take more frequent breaks, but I'm trying not to let it slow me down too much. While I was cleaning up, we were expecting a big wind and rainstorm to come through, and since the big tarp wasn't waterproof anymore, I needed a solution to keep the boat dry. Fortunately, I had another huge tarp on hand. Unfortunately, I bought it at a certain chain discount hardware store here in Canada, and it shows. It came out of the package missing grommets, not that they'd be any use since I can tear the tarp apart with my bare hands. Once it was up, I loosened the rope I was using as a ridge line to get the tarps closer to the deck. And then wrapped a rope around the boat, cinching the whole package tight with a trucker's hitch. This stopped the wind from getting under the tarp and wreaking more havoc. Then, I just had to wait for the storm to roll through and hope that I had tied my knots tight enough.
Damn.
Once the storm passed, I kept clearing things out from under the boat and peeled back the tarps to let it breathe. Then I started gathering the trees I would need for the boat shelter. The plan was to create several arches out of small, flexible trees. I know it sounds like it would fall apart at the first breath of wind, but I'll tell you that this shelter survived one of the windiest and snowiest winters this area has seen in over a decade. It took 90 km/h winds and a few feet of snow like a champ. I decided to use birch trees as the main members of the frame because of their smooth bark and relatively limb-free trunks. Plus, I've seen how flexible they can be, sometimes getting pinned under a fallen tree at a 90-degree angle without snapping. I tried to take them sparingly from clusters that were growing around the property so that I wouldn't do too much damage to any single group of trees. I also tried to find ones that had a natural curve to them so that they wouldn't fight me as much when I was bending the arches into place. Once I had them all gathered by the boat, I started trimming the small branches and smoothing them out with an old hand axe my friend Chris gave me for Christmas. After trimming them, I cut them to length and stacked them to the side to get ready for assembly. I cut a small notch at the top with my chainsaw. And then loosely tied a few wraps of rope around each pair of trees. Then, I rotated the base of one of the trees around until the rope twisted and tightened up. It's incredible how tight you can lash things together this way. The rope was so tight that it felt like it was part of the wood. It took a few tries to get the tension right, but I figured it out eventually. Once I had the tops fastened together, I gathered a bunch of larch to act as collar ties. They would help to make the Gothic arch shape when I bent the trees inward at the bottom. I first laid them in place, and then cut them to length with my chainsaw by following the angle of the arch underneath. Then, I fastened them with the beefiest structural screws I had on hand. This is the weakest point of the whole structure, but if I find the screws are too weak, I'll replace them with lag bolts. I wrestled the two arches I had finished up and over top of the boat, and then went to go make dinner. My meal was interrupted by a horrific shrieking noise coming from the forest.
What is that?
It sounded the way I imagine a banshee might sound, and was made extra terrifying because it started to circle the tent. So anyways, I went back out to work some more in the dark. Alone. I'm still not really sure what was making that noise. My best guess is a fox, but apparently bobcats also like to scream like that. I kept building the arch frames and lifted them over the boat, taking frequent breaks to keep my energy up. I also started to dig small holes for the feet of each arch, bending the legs inward to create that curved Gothic arch shape with a sharp point at the top and steep walls that would easily shed snow. Once I had two ready to go, I installed a straight ridge pole to tie them together, measuring out 8 feet between the frames. I also gave my adze a quick cleanup since it had gotten fairly rusty being under the boat. You can think of an adze as an axe turned sideways, with the blade perpendicular to the handle. They're typically used to refine hewn timbers, whether on a ship or building. It's also appeared in multiple cultures that had no contact with one another. There's a name for that, but I don't know it off the top of my head. I still need a lot of practice to get good with it. I can dig in really easily. The frame of the shelter almost looks like the ribcage of a giant fish, with its white birch poles looking like thin bones. I started the process of bracing the shelter with diagonal crosses, made mostly from an invasive species that's trying to swallow up the forest here, called glossy buckthorn. I won't get into it now, but if you've ever had to deal with this plant, you know how horrible it can be. I didn't end up finishing the bracing before the cold weather came through, and honestly just went into hibernation for the rest of the winter. I tried to work when I could, but made almost no headway. It felt like I was just spinning my tires. The first sunny day we had that was above zero, I felt like I had 3 times my normal energy. Once I had the frame all braced up, it really helped with the rigidity. It also meant that it was time to get the new tarp ready to go over top of it. I found an old gymnasium in a community center a few towns over where I could lay the tarp flat and mark out the spots where I would sew in webbing made from old ratchet straps I had lying around. I used a hot glue gun to keep the straps in place while I moved the tarp around, eventually bringing it back home to sew the webbing in permanently. Or that was the plan anyways. I ended up hand sewing 3 of the straps, but that took 5 hours, so I wanted to look for another solution. My friend Alex suggested I try rivets, and I just happened to have a bunch of leather working rivets on hand. I also picked up some pop rivets from the hardware store, which I used on the corner webbing since they're a lot stronger. But then my friend Joel was like, you know they make tarp clips, right? You know they make tarp clips, right? So, yeah, I could have saved myself like 8 hours of work. I took a quick trip up to my friend's farm to visit the animals and grab some scraps of baling twine for the shelter. I needed something to stop the birch trees from chafing the tarp, so after that I took a trip to the second-hand store in town and grabbed 6 blankets for $10. I then cut them into strips about 6 inches wide. After teaching myself how to make a constrictor knot, I started tying the blanket strips to the frame with the baling twine. Then I remembered that I own a staple gun. Duh. So I used that on the other half, which was 3 times faster. That night, at 10 p.m., after I was already in bed, I saw that the forecast was calling for 45 millimeters of rain, and all that was over the boat was the leaky old tarp. So I hopped out of bed and struggled for 45 minutes to get the new tarp underneath the old one, but pushed myself way too hard in the process. The next morning, I screwed in the anchors to the frames that I would use to tie down the new tarp, and then stripped off the old one. Then I made tie downs with rope and carabiners on one side of the shelter and trucker's hitches on the other. I want to be able to peel half the tarp back on hot days to get lots of airflow. I still want to rig up ground anchors and ropes to throw over the whole structure when we get high winds coming through, but that'll be easy enough to do later. I can finally feel warmer weather just around the corner. I saw my first crocuses today, fitting since it's the spring equinox. And so finally, with warmer weather brings boat work. Writing you once again from a boat in the woods, Joshua.